Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Q1 Sectigo Pulse webinar. I'm Megan Murphy, Marketing Assistant at Sectigo, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Presenting with us today, we have Sectigo's Chief Compliance Officer, Tim Callan. Hi, Tim. How are you?
Hi, Megan.
Joining Tim will be CTO of SSL at Sectigo, Nick France. How's it going, Nick?
I'm good, Megan. Thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will remain on mute for the duration of the webinar, which we expect to be around 45 minutes, allowing for 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. You'll be able to submit any questions you might have using the chat throughout the webinar. That's it from me. Without further ado, Tim, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Megan. So Nick and I talked about this in advance. I think we have 4 things we want to cover today. This is, again, recent developments for Q1. First of all, Sectigo is in the process of removing street address postal code information from all of our public certificates. We'll get into the specifics of that. We want to educate people on private key exposure with CSR submissions, which is a big, also a big topic right now. Camerfirma is a public CA that's been deprecated. This is something that doesn't happen very often, and when it does, it's kind of big news and it's worth discussing. And then we also wanted to get in a little bit on where digital certificates fit into the SolarWinds attack, and in particular, what code signing is and is not. So with that, let's go ahead and get in. So removal of street address and OU field information from certificates. And Nick, feel free to, maybe I'll lay out the basics here and you should feel free to chime in as you like. But there are fields that are very commonly included in TLS certificates that are not required. They are not required technically, and they are not required according to the browser root programs or the CA browser forum guidelines. And some of those, 3 of those, are street address, postal code, and we'll come to it, OU field. And as a result, those are things where certificates issued without these particular fields are 100% technically and compliance valid. I know that's an awkward construction, but you know what I'm saying. And yet they're frequently occurring in SSL certificates, and this represents a potential point of exposure, which is if there is, that becomes information that needs to be entered, or what do I want to say, included correctly in the issuing certificate. And if there's some reason why that didn't happen correctly, let's say there was a bug in the software, let's say there was some kind of technical procedural problem that occurred, then that actually could lead to a misissued certificate, and it could lead to a certificate that is revoked revoked without the foreknowledge or the desires of the subscriber.
Yes.
And so, yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I was going to say, so it is these fields, we say unnecessary. You're absolutely right, Tim. They aren't necessary, but I think it's useful to say why they're not required, as it were. So, I mean, the obvious one, things like street address and postal code, the main reason for that is there are a number of places on this earth where street address and postal code don't really apply. There's certainly certain countries and territories where they don't have what we know as a postcode or a zip code, and street addresses are, I won't say necessarily non-existent, but perhaps they don't have them, or perhaps they are different to what you and I, as living in the UK and the US, might recognize as street addresses. And so they're not firmly required within certificates. As you said, we don't have to have them in, and including the information is in effect unnecessary. And you've stated quite clearly, including that information, and if something is incorrect with it, can lead to this consequence where the certificate has to be cancelled or revoked, as we say, on very short notice, which obviously has knock-on effects for the customers currently using that certificate. So it's just to make it clear that these fields they're not necessary for the technical operation of the certificate. They don't make it any weaker, any worse, any less secure. It's purely almost like a globalization thing, right, to make sure we don't say it's required and then not be able to provide services to countries where street addresses don't exist.
Right, yes. And connected to that, I guess another point worth mentioning is the street address is still authenticated. as part of the certificate. Like that part doesn't go away. So the CA still does that work. But by not including it in the specific field, we don't run into the vagaries, as you said, of what is a street, what is a street address, what is the correct formatting of it, things along those lines that, again, without really presenting any bad information, can cause a cert to get into a forced revocation event.
I mean, well, that's one of the things as well is trying to be clear that it makes it sound like we're removing or omitting information, which we are, but it's not a bad thing. We already verify that information, so we're still checking it in the background. But the other thing to think about is this is part of the information we include in the certificate to verify an organization, a business. And the information we include in there, so even if you don't include the street address and the postal code, the address that is included is still absolutely accurate enough to be able to identify that organization. That's a critical thing for me, is how many Sectigos based in Roseland, New Jersey are there, even without the zip code and even without the exact street address?
Yeah.
When I go to the office, I can still tell a taxi driver, although ignoring Uber for a second, you can already tell somebody the taxi driver and they will still find it without that exact reference. So again, it's that point that we're not making these things any worse. It's basically omitting information or not including information in order to prevent possible problems down the line.
Right, and so the skip ahead point to be made here is Sectigo, after after decades of including this information, we have come to the conclusion that it is a better service for our customers if we do not.
Yes.
And so we are in the process of removing that. And let's maybe return to the OU field point at the end. But we are in the process of removing the street and postal fields from all of our public certificates of all types right now. SSL certs stopped having this as of March 7. So if you had a cert issued on March 7 or later, it did not have street and postal in it. Code signing, document signing, and SMIME certificates will follow by the end of the month. So we are removing this from all of our public certs, and that's going to be what we do moving forward. As mentioned, we still authenticate street and postal. That is part of the baseline requirements from the CA Browser Forum. It's part of the EV guidelines from the CA Browser Forum. We do follow those guidelines 100%. And so we do actually authenticate all of this information, and we do it using the proven methods. We also have that information. We retain that information in our records. Literally, the only thing we do differently is we don't put it in the cert. Yeah.
Well, I think one thing just to mention is that fundamentally the change for our customers, you've said we implemented this a couple of weeks ago now, but customers weren't impacted in terms of having to change their systems. They didn't have to give us more or less information. They didn't have to make changes to their systems when requesting certificates through our systems, through our APIs. However, fundamentally nothing changed as far as the customers are concerned, as far as any of our customers are concerned. Purely the certificate came out and there was, less bytes were included in the resulting certificate, but fundamentally nothing else about the process changed.
Right. You have to do nothing different.
Yes.
So you don't have to change your CSR. You don't have to change how you order. You don't have to change using an API. If you're using an API and it's sending us that information right now, that's perfectly fine. If you're sending us CSRs with that information in it, it's perfectly fine. Nothing has to change in the ordering or installation process at all. That's a very important point. And testimony to this is the fact that this change took place earlier this month. And literally, if you didn't work for Sectigo, you didn't notice. So that's good.
One of the easier changes, the kind we like. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so let's return to the OU field point real quick. So street and postal, this happened. And this is a good time, I think, to sort of put it on people's radar that we are expecting the same thing to occur for OU fields. So OU field stands for organizational unit. It's a long-term legacy field sitting inside of these certificates going back to the 1990s. And what the OU field traditionally was used for is you can say anything, you can say whatever you want in there. This is your field to use as you want. And people frequently used it to put in their department and things along those lines. And the OU field is becoming increasingly challenged in the CA browser forum and by the browsers because the information in that field is fundamentally unauthenticated. And they don't like the idea of having unauthenticated information sitting in a field inside of a public cert.
Exactly. I mean, the point of public certificates is, as we've just said, the information we include, we verify, and without going into all the details of the things you mentioned, Tim, the baseline requirements and the root programs, we verify that information with public directories, right? So this is public information. When you request a certificate with your company name in, we go out, we verify that's really your company name and address using Companies House in the UK or the various state jurisdictions in the US or wherever in the world. And this OU field, or department, as you said, is most commonly used for. It's not verifiable. It's not practically verifiable, and certainly not publicly verifiable. There's no register that says whether Sectigo has an IT department or not. Of course we do, but there's no way for any third party who's looking at this certificate to verify that information. And the argument is, because it's not externally verifiable, should we be including this information in the certificate at all? And I think the point we're trying to make here, Tim, and please correct me, is that we believe this is likely to be something that is balloted in the CAB forum, and whether that passes or not, one or more of the root programs are likely to have a sunset date as to the inclusion of this field in certificates.
You and I are predicting that this calendar year, OU fields will be disallowed one way or the other.
Yes.
And so we are trying to let you know now that this is a potential outcome. And of course, as mentioned earlier, we maintain 100% compliance with CA browser forum and root program rules. And therefore, if this becomes disallowed by the rules, we will not be issuing them. And that's all there is to it.
But I think one of the reasons to mention, Tim, that we bring this up, absolutely, this is our intention, isn't it, is with the street address and the postal code that we talked about, as you said, the deadline, the change passed wholly uneventfully. Great. One of the better changes we like. No customers have to make any change, no customer impact. Great. On to the next. The thing with the OU field, and that we are, I think, generally aware of, and it's unfortunately very difficult to directly quantify, but we are aware that there are use cases out there where the OU field is, I almost want to say, abused, because customers or enterprises, anybody, will put identifiers in there, let's say IDs or particular bits of information in there that they then look for later in the certificate, whether that's for trying to manage their own certificates, of which there are many more suitable tools, or if it's just something they are having their software look for. And quite honestly, that's a bit of a bad practice, but it is known that people do this. And so I think one of the reasons we want to mention this is to give people a heads up. Obviously there'll be more formal methods of doing that, and certainly we'll probably have more discussions. I imagine this might be another one we talk about next time, but it's important to know that this one could potentially have an impact on people.
Yes. And so if we skip ahead to the recommended actions here, right? Our recommendation, and this really, again, if you were having a problem with street address, you would have discovered by now, and we don't think anybody is, because why would you? If you are using OU fields and you feel that they are a legitimate part of your technical or procedural certificate usage, then you really need to come up with another way and get going on that now, because if this gets what do I want to say, mandated by CAB forum or by a browser root program, compliance will not be optional for Sectigo. And at that point, when we can't issue those certs, we won't issue those certs, period. And so if you put that on the radar now, so what we're recommending today is go away and look at these various places it might matter. Do you have software that for some reason is looking for the specific contents in an OU field before it does what it needs to do? Do you have a process where someone depends on the presence of the OU field? Are you using it to assign budget, right? To assign certs back to individual budgets? Are you using it to track who manages and owns certain certs, for who's responsible? Those are all the areas where this OU field may come into play. And for all of those things, there are other ways to do it. And this is the time to settle on and implement one of those other ways and get it done now so that you don't have a crisis, so that when we send you an email and say, as of, I'm making this date up, August 1, we can't have any more, then you're not going, holy moly, we got to rush to get this done. The better thing to do is get it done now, and when that email comes, everybody can just be secure that it's handled.
Absolutely, yes. Preparation, that's the key thing here, is just to make sure that you are not reliant on, I mean, probably a much wider discussion, but I think one of the key things to say is don't necessarily be reliant on information within a certificate to never change. And also, unless you are perhaps using what we call a private CA, where there are no external regulations, try not to do anything with certificates beyond the I guess the default verifications that a certificate client would do. So it's going to look at the expiry date, it's going to check it's a valid key, it's going to check the correct domain name. Doing things like certificate pinning is one, and looking for a specific OU or looking for a street address, those are all non-standard things, and you may have good justification for them, but that's down that way dangers lie.
Fragile. Yeah, and this comes, and we'll touch on this point a little later, but you've basically taken us to the point of certificate agility, right? The basic idea of certificate agility is that every certificate you have needs to be able to be substituted out at any time, right? You need all of your certificates. You need to say every one of these certificates potentially needs to be swapped out right now, and I need to be able to do that. And one of the reasons you wouldn't be able to do that is because you're depending on these kind of specific things, or you're pinning, or you're doing things along those lines. So certificate agility, definitely a best practice.
Yep, absolutely.
Next, private key exposure. So it has come to the attention of the public CA industry over the course of the last few months that there is I wouldn't say frequent, but there is a repeated and ongoing behavior where somebody presumably unwittingly exposes the private key along with the CSR for a certificate. Now, this could be when they're requesting the certificate and the private key is pasted with the CSR when the actual certificate request occurs, or it could be some other time. So for example, I've got a screen cap here of our CSR decoder, which is just available to anybody. Anybody can go there and drop in any CSR, and it'll tell you things about the CSR. You can see there, and you could paste the private key in there. And so, maybe this is a misunderstanding of the process. Maybe people feel they should be including the key when they submit it, or maybe this is a copy and paste error, or maybe there's some other explanation. But the explanation doesn't really matter, because the way PKI works, and again, the way the CA Browser Forum guidelines are unambiguously explained, if that private key is shared with a third party and the CA is aware of that fact, then that private key is exposed and that cert must be revoked.
Yep. It's an interesting one, this one, for me, because it wasn't necessarily something that really occurred to me so much. We've had CSR decoders for the longest time. Other CAs have the tools. There's a lot of other third-party tools here, and they're very useful. It is useful to be able to take your CSR, whether you're an actual certificate purchaser or ordering one, or whether you're doing some diagnostic stuff like I do. It's very useful to be able to paste this otherwise opaque block of text into a simple web tool and see what it looks like inside. no harm, no foul, it seems. But what has been happening, and what has been discovered, is that additional information was being pasted in here, and it was being logged, it was being reviewed. The fact that a private key, has been copied and pasted into a tool like this, it doesn't necessarily need to even be stored or logged anywhere. Just the simple fact that it's been exposed and obviously sent over the internet at least once in this kind of condition really suggests that it isn't being kept optimally, it isn't being kept safely and securely. Right. And you are right, Tim. We don't think that, people are certainly not doing this intentionally. I don't think there's many people going, oh, I need to put my private key in here necessarily. It tends to be accidental. They're doing it because they perhaps think they need to. They're doing it because they perhaps don't know.
Sure. And
perhaps the instructions are unclear.
Maybe they say, hey, the CA is issuing my certificates. There's no harm with them knowing the private key, or they have to know the private key, right?
Yeah.
And the answer is we don't have to know the private key. There's no technical requirement for that, and we shouldn't know the private key, and we don't want to know the private key. And once you've told us the private key, we have knowledge of the fact that that private key has been shared with a third party who shouldn't have it, that third party being us, and therefore by the rules we must revoke that certificate.
I mean, you and I certainly take it for granted because we spent far too many years than perhaps both of us want to admit dealing with this technology, and a lot of people, I mean, we talked about it in previous webinars, but now this used to be an act that many people would perhaps only do once every few years, right? And so it's very easy to do things like this where you don't really think it's a mistake. Yeah. It's a copy and paste error.
I have a vague remembrance of how I did it because it was 24 months ago, and I've done a lot of things since then. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what happens when this happens, though? So what happens when we put a private key and it's essentially exposed? This private key is, well, it's fundamentally no longer a private key. It's been copied and it's been shared. Exactly. Yeah. I was about to say public key, but then I thought, no, we be careful. There is already a correct term for that. But it means that it's exposed beyond where it should be. It's not kept securely. It's not kept safely. Right. And that means that ultimately the certificate which is tied to the private key is insecure. That certificate can be abused, right?
And
that's the problem.
Any certificate tied to that private key, because people could use a private key again. Private keys get reused.
Yes.
And so that's another important point. Once a private key is exposed, it's exposed forever. Once that knowledge is out, that knowledge is out. So even though the certificate expired, 398 days later, that certificate isn't a certificate anymore, right? It's an X certificate, but that private key is still known.
Yeah, it's still out there. And you're right. People, and again, not suggesting this is always bad practice, but private keys are reused, right? I mean, we know there are standards for private keys. Again, we've talked about it before. There's minimum key sizes, minimum standards. They do change over time. And, some people might keep the same private key around for multiple years, multiple cycles of their certificate being renewed, perhaps even using it for multiple certificates for different names, because those things are all possible. We wouldn't necessarily recommend them. But again, I understand people are going to do that in the absence of better tooling or perhaps more education and so on. So it's possible there's a bigger number of certificates for every private key than you would imagine. That's the other thing to consider.
There's not a one-to-one correlation necessarily with private keys to certs.
Yep.
And so we're taking action. We have implemented software, and we've put it into all of the places where you can send us a CSR. And what happens is that the contents are automatically scanned for a private key. If a private key is included, then no certificate can be issued against that key.
Yep.
Any certificates that we have that already have that key will be revoked. And no new certificates, not only that certificate, but new certificates that attempt issuance against that key by Sectigo will not work.
It's essentially a block list, right? I mean, this is fundamentally what this comes down to. Is once we know a private key to be compromised, to be leaked, or to be exposed, we block it. And that's the way what we're saying here. We're saying we block it going forward. We obviously revoke the certificates that we know about today, and we look back and check if there are any previous certificates that can be revoked as a result of this key, which it is a best practice. You want to make sure that you're not just looking at the single certificate that is, I guess, being used, being purchased, being renewed at that time. You've got to look to the wider scope and block it going forward. So I suppose the only upshot of this particular thing is that sometimes people may see errors when requesting a certificate that mention that the private key has previously been compromised, and hopefully that isn't something that'll take too many people by surprise, because hopefully people will realize when the key's been exposed, but at least they will receive the warning. They will be told, this key has been exposed before, we've seen it before, we know it to be compromised, you need to go and generate another one. And that's not a particularly difficult task, but it's useful to know that we are taking this approach across the entire body of certificates that we know about. And I believe, I don't know if it's necessarily bulleted here, Tim, but we also do what we're able to do, which obviously isn't necessarily automated or something we can do directly, but we can also contact other CAs and tell them similar. There is some information sharing within the community. There isn't yet a standard way to do that, which I think is something that is being worked on by some researchers around the place, but information is still shared.
It's possible to definitively share that kind of information in a way that's considered to be cryptographically proven. It's just, this isn't a thing that the industry does as a group. So by the way, a couple things. First of all, that bullet 3, that should say CSR. That's a typo on my part. I just noticed it right now. So there is no such thing as a CRS, but a CSR is what that should say. And then let's also mention that this is really only within Sectigo's control. So if you submit something to our CSR decoder and it has a private key in it, we will block you. But that doesn't mean another CA is, right?
Yeah.
This isn't a universal thing. And to Nick's point, maybe it should be, and that's something that the industry can talk about, but that isn't the case today. So
exactly.
any public CAs who are taking this kind of action are taking it individually on their own. This is a thing we're doing by ourselves for ourselves, and it doesn't mean that every other CA is doing the same thing. We know that some of them are, or say they are.
Yeah, well, I mean, other CAs should like we do. I think they're required to respond to reports of compromised keys. Most CAs we work with do, and we certainly have. It hasn't always been an automated process. Even we've only fairly recently had a more automated process for that, largely because of the growing number of compromised keys. It's just a result of the popularity of the system, increasing the number of certificates and keys generally. Therefore, your baseline of compromises goes up accordingly, and we end up in a position where we all have to automate it. You are absolutely right. It would be nice if there was a system, and as I say, I believe there are some researchers working on it, and maybe in the next year or two there'll be a system.
That would
something that's something that allows us to make sure that once a key is compromised, it is blocked across the ecosystem as a whole. And I would also say that doesn't necessarily mean that these, there is a malicious angle to this. Certainly, if someone compromises a key because it's stolen and they can't get a certificate from Sectigo, they could go and get one from someone else with the same key. So that there is an angle of kind of, I guess, maliciousness to it, but there's also the angle of the opposite. There are non-malicious actions, but we still want to make sure that can't turn into abuse, and so the information sharing would be an incredibly useful thing once we get there.
Yeah, and just to really take it all the way, once you submitted something to my CSR decoder, that means that went across the public internet. So once it went across, once it went across the public internet, fundamentally you don't know what happened to it. So right there, there you go. And then the last point here to be made is, now that we've implemented the software, we intend in the pretty near future to basically create one or more search queries to find the previously exposed private keys. Excuse me.
Bless you.
We intend to search our existing certificate base for previously exposed keys and revoke the certificates when they are found. So we don't expect this as a huge number. However, Hypothetically, if one of you on this webinar has certificates running where the CSRs were submitted to us by accident or misunderstanding, when it doesn't necessarily mean it was you, it could have been someone else in your organization. Hypothetically, if that comes up, then you will get a revocation notice and we will revoke that cert. And again, we have no choice. That's what we have to do. So just be aware if that happens to you, which is unlikely, but not impossible. If that
The number
happens
is
to
the
you, then
number
that's
is the
what's
numbers are
going
not
on.
huge, are they? This
Yeah,
isn't
well, we don't
a
know, but we don't
hugely
think
common
it's huge.
occurrence.
Yeah,
It's
this is
well,
a pretty rare thing.
yeah, it is. It's a problem enough that we've discovered it, other CAs have discovered it, and action is being taken.
Yeah.
But it's, I suppose, what I was trying to say in terms of revocation events and things we saw last year, where there were millions of certificates impacted. It's not something on the same scale,
Not ours,
you know.
not
But
millions of ours,
certainly we
but
don't
yes.
think so. Yeah.
All right, so recommended actions. First of all, just be really careful how you use CSRs and online tools from any provider. Just be careful. Think about what you're putting in. Don't, pay attention to what you're hitting paste on.
Yeah.
Exercise extreme caution in reuse of private keys. I mean, I guess I'm not going to go so far as to say don't do it, but gee, be aware of all these risks and problems that we've talked about. And if your key was compromised and you didn't know it, if you're using it on multiple certs, then there's more exposure. And gosh, really exercise extreme caution if this is a policy or practice that you have. If you do have any certs where you're not 100% confident that these keys are secure, or if you're afraid that maybe you're going to be in this, upcoming revocation event once we search our certificate base, you can replace these certificates on your own with
Oh yeah.
new fresh certificates. You can do it anytime, and that way you know that you won't be in a revocation event. So if there's anything that you're in any way unsure about, you do have the option of replacing these certificates, and you should bear that in mind. If it's something you think you ought to do, then you ought to do it. And just in general, unexpected revocation events happen. It's part of public certificates, and there have been some big events last year, and like you talked about, millions of certs compromised, and um, that therefore you always need to know what you have. You need visibility, and we strongly recommend you need the ability to automatically deal with your certs in volume. So some kind of automation approach and visibility on what you have are really indispensable to maintaining a high uptime operation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one other kind of side point I'd just like to very quickly make on item one that you put there, Tim. There are a number of tools online for CSR decoding, but there's also a number of tools online for generating CSRs and generating private keys. We could probably do an extended topic on this at some point, because it's something that gets asked quite a lot: is should I use them, or are they safe? My honest answer is, again, that they can be useful tools for testing. Certainly, even after nearly 2 decades of doing this, I probably can't remember the exact open SSL incantation off the top of my head to generate a CSR that I'm specifically looking for. It's just not something I can always remember. So these nice online tools are great for testing. But the problem is, you don't really know who's operating them. You don't know if the keys are being logged. You don't know. Many of them are kind of server side and not client side. So you can't really trust that the keys aren't being leaked somewhere else. So I think as a kind of extension to that, without going into too much more of it, is just use any of these online key and CSR and online PKI tools. Use them with caution. Exercise common sense. By all means, use them for testing, but don't go and use one of these CSR generators for creating the CSR for your main certificate website, your main e-commerce portal or something. Please don't do that. Try and do it properly where it's supposed to be, and just use those tools with a little bit of a sense of caution, I'd say.
Okay, I think that's great. Number 3. So as I mentioned, there is a public CA. It's a Spanish public CA called Camerfirma. I'm probably not pronouncing that very well. And Camerfirma is in the process of having its roots distrusted by major browsers.
Yep.
And this is an event that occurs, seems to be about every 2 years, more or less. That's the rough frequency of it. And it's been the same story every time, which is that there have been a lot of problems over time. I've got a screen cap of the issue list on the right. from Bugzilla, and you can see a lot of problems, right? There have been a lot of problems over time, and the response to those problems did not instill confidence in the community, in particular in the browser, decision makers, that this was a CA that had the technical ability and the what do I want to say, the commitment to operate a public CA that they were prepared to put trust in.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing to note here is we've seen, you're right, Tim, we've seen distrusts, every couple of years. It's becoming a more common event than it certainly was a long time ago. If you go back 10 years, this didn't really happen. There was
And it
often
happened
talks of
when
things
there
like,
was no choice, right? When
yeah,
Guitar blew up, it was just there
yeah,
was
it
no
happened. It happened
choice.
when the compromise was, when there was compromise, or where there was, it almost past the point of no return. Like there was no way this CA could be trusted. But also those CAs were smaller. Now I think Camerfirma. Again, this is not meant in any disrespectful way, but certainly in the scale of things, they have a very particular market. But globally, they're perhaps not one of the most well-known CAs. And so my point I'm trying to make there is that it was certainly, it's not as hard as it used to be to kind of distrust these CAs no matter the size, right? And they can now be done for these kind of compliance reasons. This isn't a CA a CA that's been compromised. This isn't keys that have been stolen. What the root programs, particularly Google and Mozilla, who are the two we've listed here taking action, what they're basically saying is, for the representation of the users that they have, so the millions, potentially billions between the two of them, they are basically saying that we cannot allow our users to continue to trust certificates from this CA. They don't believe that it's in their users' best interest to continue to do that, and so they're beginning with this deprecation plan. So it's something that thankfully doesn't happen too often, but can now happen for reasons beyond like complete and utter compromise of the CA itself.
Yes, and so we should expect, like this clearly is part of the browser's ecosystem hygiene program, and we should expect it to continue to be that way. And we should expect CAs to continue to be expected to get over some minimum bar, and in the event that they don't, that this kind of event will occur. There's every reason to believe that the browsers view this as a good practice and will keep this in their playbook.
Yep.
I don't think they're actively looking to trust CAs, but clearly they're willing to distrust CAs.
Yeah,
So
and
you
I
see
think
this
on the whole, it is actually, it's kind of a good thing that the ecosystem can support things like this. It may not be for Camerfirma and their customers, and obviously there's migration and things that we'll talk briefly about in a second. But
right.
I think users in general can trust that the ecosystem is strong because these decisions are able to be taken, and they're not taken lightly. I think certainly we know people at Mozilla and we know people at Google who have to make these decisions, and it is not an easy decision to make. Technically, kind of politically, if you like, legally, there's other aspects than beyond flipping a couple of bits in a configuration file, and it is certainly not an easy task, but it is a good thing that these changes can be made so that we're all effectively kept safer, right? That's really what we're talking about here. It's safety for everybody.
Absolutely. And you see the dates here. So, Chrome 90, it's already distrusted in the beta. And in the month of April, it's going to stop working in all Chrome and Firefox installations, at which point basically those certificates are useless. So if you're using any Camerfirma certs, you need to get those swapped out. That's one thing to be aware of. And I would certainly predict, I don't have any inside knowledge, but I'd be deeply surprised if they were offering certificates anymore, right? If anyone's going to buy an SSL cert from them, and if they are buying an SSL cert, it's only going to work for a month. So, they probably aren't. And basically, at least as a public TLS CA, they're done.
Yeah. I mean, they certainly will be able to probably still service their customers somehow. They'll be, one of the things that happens often when these events occur is the CAs are allowed to, they're still allowed to offer certificates. They will just have to do it through another more established CA. They will not have the same
Right.
levels of
They can't use
control.
those routes. Yeah. But this is an important point. Unlike some other changes, we talk about other changes in the past, like for instance, when we moved down to 398-day certs, where your old certs were fine, right? Your old certs got to run their full lifespan. It's just moving forward to your certs aren't allowed, right? We talked about that last year. Or our street address stuff. If you have a cert existing today with street and postal, it's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. We're just not going to allow it. If OU fields get deprecated, it'll be the same way. If you have OU certs with OU fields, they'll run their full lifespan. Root distrust is a different animal. When the root distrust occurs, your certificate stops working even if it was issued before the distrust and it has remaining lifespan on it, it will still stop working. So if someone has Camerfirma certs and they expire sometime after April 13, they still stop working on April 13. So that's where it's a little different. Those certs need to be swapped out, and that needs to happen, or you will have an outage.
Exactly. Yep. It's definitely a hard ending, if you like. There is no kind of rollout dates or anything like that. It's when this happens, and that's why it's such a big and difficult decision to take. But it's important that anybody that's likely to be impacted by this doesn't have a whole lot of time to make some changes, which of course ties back into agility and automation and everything we like to repeat every time we do these, Tim.
Absolutely, and certificate agility, right? This is where I planned on bringing it up, but you beat me to the punch. So first recommended action, again, things happen that are out of your control in the world of certificates, and this is a good example. And there are people out there who had to get all their certs swapped out, or have to get all their certs swapped out sometime in the next month. And just be aware of what certificates you have, how they're deployed, where they are, and be able to swap them out at will. It's very important. Second of all, if you really want to go deep on this, and I don't recommend this for everybody, but if you really want to go deep on this, you actually are able to pay attention to your CA's reputation. And there are two main sources for this. First one we call Bugzilla, which is Mozilla's bug system. And it includes bugs for the public root store aspect, which is where this comes up. And you can see that's at bugzilla.mozilla.org. And you can go there and you can do searches. So you can search on the name of your CA and you can see what's happening, see how people are talking about it. And if there's a bug you're interested in tracking, you can ask it to send you notifications every time it changes. So that's a thing that you can do. Again, this is for the serious, but if you're serious, you can do that. And then also Mozilla's Mozilla Dev Security Policy, or MDSP, as it's frequently called, is a place where the community goes to talk about matters of public certs and public trust that aren't explicitly bugs. So it's a place where the community can go to discuss other issues. What do we think we should do about this or that? And I have this thought, I have this worry. Hey, maybe we could make things better if we do it this way. And that's where that discussion goes on. And once again, these are both public, and most people aren't paying attention to these things. And if you're busy and you can't, that's fine. But if you want to, these are the places where this conversation happens.
I mean, MDSP is it's a fairly low volume mailing list. There are spikes and peaks and troughs, but it's as you say, it's for discussion topics that are not bugs. So there are a lot of interesting topics. I mean, maybe that's just me saying it because of what we do, but there are certainly some good discussions that occur on there that are they're of wide-ranging impact, right? Because this is Mozilla, and the Google guys often contribute there and often monitor it. Most of the root programs actually monitor it as well, even if they don't post. We know that it's monitored by people at Microsoft and Apple. So it is kind of a little
CAs,
nexus.
Of course.
Yeah, it's a little nexus for our industry. But some of the topics that get discussed on there, beyond the policies and beyond, as you said, Tim, bugs, they are quite interesting topics, and they do have kind of wide-reaching effects for all of us, really, because they're fundamentally like browser security issues, and everybody uses the web all day. So it's not a dreadful one to read, whereas Bugzilla is certainly a bit more of a bit more of a harder read. Yeah,
it's very, very down in the weeds. Yes. So SolarWinds and digital certificates. So SolarWinds obviously was a very big deal, very big attack, made a lot of headlines, and there's an important way that digital certificates, especially code signing, fit into the whole ecosystem of the SolarWinds attack. So, I've been asked about this by a number of people for clarification, and we thought it would be good to just kind of share how does a supply chain attack and code signing, how do those two fit in with each other? So SolarWinds was a supply chain attack, and what that means is that the software supply chain was used to commit the attack. So you find a software provider that you can compromise. You go into that software provider and you put your malicious code into their code base. And then what happens is when that software provider provides updates, those updates carry your malicious code in them, right? The update itself is a Trojan horse. And these updates are signed with code signing. And then as a result, they are accepted on the other end. They are code signed updates. They are packaged up. They are unlashed. They're unwrapped and installed. And now the malicious code is sitting in the end, the end client's environment. And that's how the SolarWinds attack occurred.
Yep.
And so I think the question I get is, was code signing compromised? Did code signing fail? And so let's explain what code signing does and what code signing doesn't. When you sign your code, you're packaging it up, you're cryptographically ensuring two things. Number one, that the code that is received on the other end is bit for bit identical to the code that was signed. So I take a module, anything, it's any file. It could be a text file, it could be a JPEG. Any file gets signed and it is bit for bit identical to what is opened at the other end. And then the second thing is that there's a wrapper around it. There are statements about who the signing authority is, or who the signer is, rather. And the signer, that information is unspoofable. That is the real information that was really provided by the publicly trusted CA with the code signing certificate. So if you're a certain software developer, if something comes to you, it's an update and it says it was signed by Adobe Incorporated in San Jose, California, you know that is authentic information.
Yeah, I was going to say when you say you install an update for your graphics card drivers, you can download that. You can see it was signed by NVIDIA or someone else. You can see that it shows you. It pops up and says this is who signed it. You can see the organization, and that's your also combines the two items. That's your reassurance that when you downloaded it, the file they created the file, they packaged this up together, and then the last thing they do, and it is the last thing in that chain that unfortunately was compromised, but the final thing is the code is signed, the application is signed, then it's distributed, it's put on a content delivery network, download mirrors wherever it goes, back in the day on CDs in the box, right, things like that, but it's distributed, and when you download it, you know that you're getting the exact same thing, as you say, Tim, bit for bit, that they created and they released. So it's really designed to prevent against things like and this regularly happens, but malware that injects something into the code itself after it's created, into the application, something that wraps the installer, installs something else first, and then installs the software you think you're getting. And all the kind of attacks that can, probably happen, they are prevented because it is this wrapper and it's this digital signature, this wrapper around the application that you've just downloaded or just received.
And so that's what code signing is. It's the wrapper, and it's authenticating that the code is exactly the same, and it's authenticating where it came from. Code signing has no visibility on whether or not this code is good. It's not saying that the software is bug-free or useful or compatible with your operating system or that the game is fun. It's not saying any of that. It's also not saying that there's no malware in there.
No,
what it's
absolutely.
saying is this is the same as what the software publisher signed.
I do get the same question a lot, Tim, as well. It's like, well, when we sign code, do we have to give you the code? And I
Right.
suppose part of that is in the name, right? We call it a code signing certificate, but it's often known elsewhere. I guess not elsewhere, but it could
Yeah.
otherwise be known as a software publishing certificate or an
Or a
application
file
signing
signing
certificate.
certificate, right?
Exactly. So we don't have access to the code. People don't have to upload code to a CA like Sectigo to get it signed and then we compile it, because even if they did, hand on heart, we're not going to have the resources to track through millions and millions of lines of code and determine whether it's good or bad. And if you watch the details of the SolarWinds attack, it took experts, people that actually wrote the SolarWinds software in the first place, it took them a heck of a long time to even discover the few lines of code that were injected that were malicious. So
Right.
it's again, Tim, your point really is to say that what the code signing does is it wraps the software. It means that you get the same thing that the manufacturer or the vendor intended you to have, and you can run it. It doesn't say anything about the state or the type or the kind of software or what it's going to do. It's not a good or a bad indicator. You could, and again, this is kind of a theory, but someone could take a code signing certificate and sign malware with it. That is possible. That has happened in the past. And stolen code signing certificates are one of the reasons we have some industry regulations about how we give people code signing certificates, because these things can get stolen. So it's not an attestation on what the code does or what it is. It's an attestation that you have the same code that the vendor intended you to have.
Yeah, and so it still protects against some very important things, which you already mentioned, Nick, right? It's the kind of the easiest attacks, the low-hanging fruit attacks, the script kiddie attacks. It does a very good job of defending against. So you can't substitute a file for an expected file of the same name, for instance, or you can't take take someone's software update, insert your own DLL in it, repackage it, and then send it on. Those are all things that you can't do, and that's really good. This was a very, very sophisticated, advanced, persistent threat, right? This was Cozy Bear, which is a very well-known APT that did this. So it's we've gotten in a much different league in terms of the kind of attack that's possible once code signing's there. So what are the recommendation actions? Number one, continue using code signing. Code signing is a good practice, right? Don't let the SolarWinds
required. Well, it's basically required everywhere, right? I mean, there's very few software platforms that don't let you run code without it, because, and the reason they do that, the reason Microsoft make Windows almost enforce code sign, or at least give you nasty warnings if you run unsigned code, is because it's safer and it's because it's better. So it's not something to stop using because you perhaps don't understand what it does, or you think it might have caused these problems in the first place. Absolutely not. It's something that is required, is needed. Keep using it.
And if you are worried about being the next SolarWinds, the place to focus your energy is on protecting your source, not on the code signing aspect.
Yep.
All right. If you liked this conversation, I have a regular podcast with another associate of Nick's in mind, Jason Sirocco, and Nick is a repeat guest. And we talk about all matters digital certificates and PKI. We have published more than 150 episodes so far, and we're going strong. So by all means, feel free to check us out. And with that, let's go to questions. So Megan, do we have any questions?
Yeah, Tim, we got some great questions.
Okay.
So the first one, there are applications that examine the OU fields as a certificate from a public CA and make decisions based upon it. The CA's CPs can indicate it is unauthenticated, so why does it have to be deprecated?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it comes back to what Tim and I were discussing about the verification of information in certificates. These are public certificates. They are publicly trusted. The idea is they are making representations to the general public by way of Google and Microsoft and Mozilla and Apple, including the roots for their users. We're making attestations to this information here being correct and being valid. And if we are including information that is, essentially unverified, then that's not really doing that job. That's not attesting to publicly verifiable information. And kind of more details to the point, certainly you can put in your CP and CPS, and that's a certificate policy and a certificate practice statement. They're documents that a CA publishes that says, this is how we do what we do, and this is how we sign certs. You could put information, a clause, I guess, in there that says this information is not verified. But we also have to look at what the baseline requirements say about that information, and what has to be verified in there and what has not to be verified in there. And again, because it isn't publicly verifiable information, it arguably has no place in publicly trusted certificates at all, and is likely to go down the way of not being allowed.
Regardless of what the CP says, if I were from one of the browsers here, I would probably say, regardless of what the CP says, an end user who isn't necessarily looking at the CP could look at the certificate contents and be misled. And that's the fundamental, that's the fundamental argument that's not going to change. All right, next question.
When will Microsoft distrust Camerfirma?
I don't know. I haven't heard anything about Microsoft in particular. If they have plans, I didn't get wind of them. But once again, I think that's academic, because with Chrome and Firefox distrusting their SSL certs are done. If you're interested in Camerfirma code signing, I don't know if there are any plans. I don't know if you know or not, Nick, if they have any plans to continue a code signing business, because in principle they could without the browsers. But again, is it even worth their while to do that? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the difficulty with that question is Microsoft are, the reason we know about what's happening with Camerfirma, particularly from a Google and a Mozilla point of view, is because those organizations, or in Google's case, the PKI part of the organizations, are run very openly. As we talked about, there's the public Bugzilla system, which is basically any bug in any Mozilla piece of software, and then you've got the mailing list. They're public, so there are public discussions about what to do, and they actually take the input from the public and the community, and everybody can see what's going on. Those same processes are absolutely happening at Microsoft and absolutely happening at Apple. I know they are from the people I know and have worked with, but we don't see them. They're private organizations, just like the vast majority of organizations are. And so I suppose my answer would be, we don't know what Microsoft are exactly going to do. We don't know if they have a date in mind, but I can guarantee they're absolutely actively discussing it. They are, looking at all their telemetry to see what impact it has on Windows users. They will be communicating with Camerfirma, I have absolutely no doubt. And when they feel it's necessary, they will publish a guideline, or they will publish some information that says we are taking this action on this date. And that's how Microsoft and Apple as well have long since worked. It's just we can't give the dates because we don't get any insight into their processes.
How will I know if a change to OU fields is coming up, and when should I expect that to happen?
How will you know from us? I mean, certainly.
I'll
let you go.
Right.
Yep, we'll tell you. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, if we're going to discontinue OU fields, we will notify. So we give a lot of notification on these things. We had a route that expired last year, and we were notifying customers like 6 months in advance that it was coming. We provided notification months in advance about the street address thing. So as soon as we know, we will let you know. Now, if an external party gives us a deadline, like a browser does, then we won't be able to notify you before we find out ourselves. However, usually they give people enough breathing room that they can, make the changes they need to make. When Apple brought maximum certificate term down to 398 days, they probably announced 6 months-ish before the actual date came. So it gave people a lot of time to adjust. Again, I'm predicting that rule will come down. It will come down this year, and it may even come down early enough that the actual deprecation occurs this year. But when we find out, we'll let you know.
I think one of the things, just to add to that, and everything you said is right, Tim, is the public certificates, public service certificates are all logged. They're all publicly available. So decisions can be made backed with data. Now, obviously, that data doesn't show whether those OUs are used by customers in non-standard ways, like we said, analyzing them outside of whether the certificate is valid and in date and so on. But certainly, the folks at Google and the folks at Mozilla can look at the corpus of certificates that are out there. They can examine how many have OUs. They can perhaps group them down and have a look at how many OUs are out there and what they seem to be doing, and they can potentially start to make some decisions based on that data. So, my feeling, and I completely agree with Tim, we're likely to see some kind of announcement this year, whether that is a ballot that is successful or whether that is a root program statement outside of a ballot. I think that will happen this year, and I probably think the deprecation will happen within this year as well. These tend to be kind of 3 to 6 month periods, and we'd like to give as much notice as possible. And I would probably suggest that we will do, Tim, what we did last time with the change down to 1 year, is that we actually implemented our own deadline slightly in advance of the official deadline, so that people had a couple of weeks of breathing room in case there were some hugely critical issues, and we could at least manually intervene in that 2-week period. So
Right.
The short answer is, as soon as we know, we will obviously let all of our customers know. We will communicate. We can see who's using what and try and communicate to customers. But I would also, as Tim said in the slides earlier, have a look at your own certificate base, determine what you're doing with things like OUs, if you're doing additional checking on those, and quite honestly, start to question whether that is necessary, start to look at alternatives, and start to think about what happens if OU goes away tomorrow. What parts of my system do I need to fix and or change?
Yep, agreed.
All right, so one last question. If a private key is sent to the CA issuing the cert, is that really a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim said it before. That exact question is does it really matter if the CA has a copy? Well, there's a couple of things there. Number one, it's been sent to us. How has it been sent to us? Has it been transmitted, through a form over the internet? Can we be assured that it hasn't been sent anywhere else? No, there's no way to prove that. So, we kind of have to assume the worst. I think the other thing is there are a couple of regulations in our industry. Mozilla themselves have one, and they basically say that CAs can't generate keys for the subscribers, so we can't generate keys for our customers. Right. And so it kind of stands to reason that the reason for that is they don't want us to have them, and we shouldn't have them. We don't want the liability of keys. We don't want to have anybody able to point a finger at us and go, oh, Sectigo could have done something bad because they had the private key. So, yes, having the private key out anywhere outside of where it is supposed to be, which is private within the service it is being used on, I would say is a risk, regardless of who you send it to, whether that's your CA or, your hosting company or your parent, your hosting company, but, anybody that you send it to that should not have it, that presents a risk of compromise, and yes, it should be revoked.
Cool.
That's it for questions. As always, thank you, Tim and Nick, and thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be sharing today's webinar recording tomorrow, so be on the lookout. Thanks again.